My dad threw me out of the house and I learned what family actually was. When my dad found out I was pregnant, he didn't care that it was a man twice my age who forced himself on me. All he saw was a slut. He threw me out in the snow in the middle of the night. I was 16, and I had no idea where to go. I spent the night in the park bathroom trying not to freeze to death while touching my stomach and thinking about this baby I never wanted. Missy Nyla found me the next morning sleeping in the school bathroom because I couldn't stay in the park after what happened with those men who kept circling back. She was my English teacher who always said I could write my way out of this town if I just kept believing in myself. She took one look at my garbage bags and I completely broke down. I sobbed so hard I couldn't breathe. "You're coming home with me," she said, and I collapsed against her because nobody had hugged me since that night, and I needed someone to tell me I wasn't disgusting. She canceled her classes and drove me to her house. I cried the whole way because kindness felt so foreign. Miss Nyla lived alone in a house full of books and cats that wouldn't leave my stomach alone like they could sense the life inside. She made me a bedroom in her office and came to every doctor's appointment where nurses assumed she was my mother, and we never corrected them. At night, she'd hold my hair during morning sickness and tell me about her wife Marina who died 3 years ago. They'd tried for kids for a decade but ran out of time. "Maybe you're both my second chance," she whispered, while I threw up again, and I sobbed because this stranger was being the mother mine refused to be. We fell into a routine where she watched me do online school while I helped grade papers. Slowly, my belly grew, and so did this feeling that maybe I could love this baby even though I hated how it started. She'd put her hand on my stomach and tell the baby about all the books they'd read together and all the places they'd see, and I started believing we could actually do this. When Oliver was born, Miss Nyla held my hand through 19 hours of labor while I screamed and begged for my mother who never came. My parents ignored every call from the hospital. She cut his cord and was the first to hold him after me. We both cried when he grabbed her finger with his tiny, perfect hand. "Can he call you Grandma?" I asked, and she sobbed yes while kissing his tiny head. We went home together and built this strange, beautiful life in her little house. She taught him songs in different languages while I taught him to laugh at my silly faces. He took his first steps reaching for her glasses because they sparkled in the light. He said Mama to me and Nana to her, and I finally understood that family was about choosing each other every single day. We were happy in a way I never thought possible after everything that happened. My father showed up when Oliver was 2 after my cousin posted a photo of us at the park without my permission. He stood on the porch in his expensive suit saying Mom was dying of guilt and wanted to meet her grandson. "Come home and apologize for the shame you caused and maybe we can work something out," he said, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. Miss Nyla stepped between us and told him to leave before she called the police about child abandonment. "That's my daughter you're interfering with," he screamed while Oliver cried and clung to my legs terrified of this angry stranger. "She became my daughter the day you threw her away," Missy Nyla said in that voice that could silence any classroom full of teenagers. My father's face went purple with rage. He pointed at her and screamed that she was a predator taking advantage of vulnerable girls, and he'd make sure everyone knew what she really was. I wanted to disappear into the floor, but Ms. Nyla just smiled and said, "Everyone already knows I'm the woman who saved your daughter when you failed her." The next morning, Miss Nyla didn't come to breakfast, and my heart knew something was wrong before my brain did. I found her on her bedroom floor clutching her chest and gasping my name like she needed to tell me something important. The paramedics worked on her for 40 minutes while she kept trying to reach for me. Oliver kept asking why Nana wouldn't wake up and why her face looked so gray. I begged them to try harder because she's the only family we've ever had. She survived, but at the hospital had to be put on life support where the machines were doing all the breathing and pumping. "She made you medical proxy last year," the doctor said, showing me papers while my hands shook too hard to read them. "She doesn't want extraordinary measures, so you need to decide soon whether to continue life support." I held her hand while Oliver played with her fingers, not understanding why she wouldn't squeeze back like she always did during their morning game. I kept whispering, "Please don't leave us." The machines wouldn't stop their beeping while I squeezed Missy Nyla's cold hand harder. Oliver kept tugging on her fingers the way he did every morning when they played their counting game. The doctor stood by the foot of her bed holding a clipboard and watching me with this patient look. Oliver pulled on my shirt asking why Nana wouldn't sing the good morning song she always sang to him. My throat closed up because yesterday she was standing on our porch telling my father off with her teacher voice. Now her face looked gray like old newspaper and the machines were doing all her breathing. The doctor cleared his throat and moved closer to show me some papers on his clipboard. His finger pointed to Miss Nyla's signature at the bottom, while he explained I was her medical proxy. My hands shook so bad I couldn't hold the clipboard steady enough to read the words. The paper said something about no extraordinary measures in her neat teacher handwriting that I'd seen on hundreds of my essays. He told me we didn't have to decide right away, but we should honor what she wanted. Oliver started crying because he was hungry and scared of all the beeping sounds. A woman walked in with a soft voice and introduced herself as Constance Parker, the social worker. She had this thick folder under her arm and suggested we go somewhere quieter to talk. She found us a small room down the hall with some toys for Oliver to play with. While he stacked blocks, she explained what being a medical proxy meant and handed me pamphlets about hospital services. Her calm way of talking made my chest loosen just a little bit. She said she'd be here to help us through everything and wrote her number on a card. Dr. Wesley Wong knocked and came in to explain what happened to Ms. Denila's heart and brain. He sat down across from me and used his hands to show how her heart stopped pumping blood for 40 minutes. The paramedics got it started again, but her brain went without oxygen for too long. He wanted to run more tests tomorrow to check her brain function better. Oliver kept pulling on my sleeve, asking when we could go back to Nana's house for lunch. Dr. Wong's face stayed gentle while he warned me that 40 minutes without oxygen usually meant bad damage. The ICU had rules about kids not being allowed, but the nurses let Oliver stay. He wouldn't eat his crackers unless he could see Nana and kept crying every time we tried to leave. I had to keep him busy with coloring books while doctors kept coming in with more information. Constance said she could arrange volunteers to watch Oliver during important meetings if I needed. That night, I sat in the hard plastic chair next to Miss Nyla's bed holding Oliver. He finally fell asleep against my chest with his thumb in his mouth. I kept thinking about that first night 3 years ago when she brought me to her house. She made me chamomile tea and let me cry for hours without asking any questions. She just kept saying "you're safe now" over and over until I finally believed her. Now I was the one whispering those same words to her still body under all the tubes. Oliver shifted in my sleep, and I realized we were basically orphans without her. The fear from yesterday kept washing over me in waves that made my hands shake. My father's purple face screaming that Ms. Nyla was a predator kept playing in my head. His threat to tell everyone what she really was made my stomach twist into knots. Constance must have noticed my breathing getting weird because she asked if there were safety concerns. I told her about my father showing up yesterday and what he said about Ms. Nyla. She wrote something on her clipboard and said she'd put a note in the system right away. That night, after Oliver finally went to sleep on the little cot they brought, I read Miss Nyla's papers. The advance directive spelled out everything in legal words about ventilators and feeding tubes. My eyes kept getting blurry reading the part that said no artificial life support if there's no hope. She'd written a personal note at the bottom in blue pen. It said she watched Marina suffer on machines for 3 weeks and never wanted that. The weight of everything crashed down on me all at once in the hallway. I couldn't breathe and my chest felt like someone was sitting on it. Constance found me bent over by the vending machines, gasping for air. She showed me how to breathe in for 4 counts and hold it. She kept her hand on my back, saying I wasn't alone in this. She gave me a paper about grief that I shoved in my pocket without reading. The next morning, this older woman named Betty showed up wearing a volunteer vest. She said she could take Oliver to the playroom while I met with the doctors. I didn't want to let him go with someone I didn't know, but I needed to actually hear what the doctors were saying without him pulling on me. Betty had this soft grandmother way about her that Oliver seemed to like. He grabbed his favorite book that Nana always read him about the hungry caterpillar. Betty promised they'd read it together and maybe do some puzzles. I watched them walk down the hall with my heart pounding, but I had to trust her. Constance was already waiting for me in a small meeting room down the hall with papers spread across the table and a man in a wrinkled button-down shirt sitting next to her. He stood up when I walked in and stuck out his hand, while Constance explained this was Dave Gutierrez from Legal Aid, who could help me understand everything. His handshake was firm but gentle, and he had these deep lines around his eyes that made him look like someone who'd seen enough hard stuff to not judge anyone. He pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in notes and started going through the basics of medical proxy authority, while I kept glancing at the door worried about Oliver. Dave explained that my job wasn't to decide what I wanted for Miss Nyla, but to make the choices she would make for herself, based on what she'd told me and written down. He showed me copies of the advance directive again, and walked through each section slowly, while I tried to focus on the words, instead of the way my chest kept getting tighter. When I asked about my father and whether he could take Oliver, Dave's whole face changed, and he leaned forward with his elbows on the table. He said my father had absolutely zero legal claim to Oliver since he'd thrown me out when I was pregnant and never established any relationship with his grandson. The medical proxy designation was ironclad too, since Miss Nyla had done everything properly with witnesses and notarization. He mentioned there might be estate issues if something happened to Miss Nyla, but we'd handle that when we needed to. The relief hit me so hard I started sobbing right there in that little room, while Dave pushed a box of tissues across the table, and Constance rubbed my back. After I pulled myself together, I told Dave I needed another opinion on Miss Nyla's brain function before I could even think about making any decisions. He nodded and said that was completely reasonable, and actually showed I was taking my responsibility seriously. We walked back to the ICU where Dr. Wong was checking Miss Nyla's monitors, and I asked him directly for a second neurological assessment. He didn't hesitate or act annoyed, just said he understood completely and would schedule it for tomorrow morning with their best neurologist. He even said I was being thorough and responsible, which made me feel slightly less like I was drowning in decisions I wasn't old enough to make. Oliver came running back from the playroom with Betty holding a picture he'd drawn of him and Nana reading books together. He climbed into my lap and asked if the doctors were going to fix Nana's broken head while pointing at all the machines around her bed. I told him they were trying their best while Betty quietly slipped out with a gentle squeeze to my shoulder. The next morning started with my phone ringing before Oliver even woke up. The woman on the other end said she was from the school district's HR department, and they'd received a complaint about inappropriate conduct between Ms. Nyla and a student. My whole body went cold because I knew immediately this was my father trying to destroy her even while she was dying. The HR lady sounded skeptical and kept saying things like, "We have to investigate any complaint," and "This is just procedure." But I could tell she thought it was garbage. She said someone would need to come interview me at some point, but for now they were just doing preliminary fact-finding. I hung up and wanted to throw the phone across the room, but Oliver was stirring in his hospital cot. That afternoon, everything got worse when Oliver's forehead felt hot during lunch, and he started crying that his tummy hurt. The ICU nurse checked his temperature, and it was 101.4, which meant we needed to go to the pediatric emergency department right away. I had to leave Miss Nyla alone with all her machines while I carried Oliver down 3 floors to pediatrics, where they made us wait 40 minutes before a doctor could see us. Oliver kept crying for Nana to kiss his forehead and make the OEs go away like she always did when he was sick. The pediatric nurses were kind but busy, and it took forever for them to determine it was just a mild virus, probably from stress and the hospital environment. They gave him some medicine for the fever and told me to keep him hydrated while I sat there torn between needing to be with him and desperately wanting to be back with Ms. Danila. We made it back to the ICU by evening where Dr. Wong was waiting with another doctor I hadn't met before. They'd done the second neurological exam that morning while I was dealing with Oliver's fever, and now they had the results. Dr. Wong's face told me everything before he even opened his mouth, but he still explained carefully that the tests showed significant anoxic brain injury, with minimal brain activity. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The other doctor showed me the scans on his tablet and pointed to all the dark areas where Mizzy Nyla's brain tissue had been damaged from lack of oxygen. He said there was no possibility of recovery from this level of injury, and her brainstem was only maintaining basic functions because of the machines. The words hit me like physical punches, but I appreciated that they weren't giving me false hope. Constance appeared beside me and said she'd scheduled a family meeting for tomorrow morning with the whole care team to discuss goals of care and next steps. She explained this was standard procedure when families were facing these kinds of decisions, and everyone would be there to support whatever choice I made for Ms. Nyla. That night, I sat next to Miss Nyla's bed, holding her hand, while Oliver slept fitfully in his cot, still warm from the fever. I told her about his temperature and how he kept asking for her kisses, and about the stupid HR complaint that we both knew was my father's doing. I pulled out a notebook from my bag and started writing her a letter with all the things I'd never gotten to say properly. The words came out messy and tear-stained, but I wrote about how she saved my life that morning in the school bathroom and became the mother I'd needed. I wrote about how Oliver would always know his Nana was the bravest woman who chose us when nobody else would. My voice cracked and broke as I read it out loud to her still form, while Oliver colored with crayons on the floor beside us. 2 of Miss Nyla's teaching colleagues showed up quietly with a cardboard box while I was reading. They didn't say much, just squeezed my shoulder and left the box on the chair before slipping out. Inside were dozens of cards from her students and fellow teachers with messages about how much she meant to them. Oliver got excited seeing all the colorful drawings and started pulling them out one by one to look at the pictures. Dave came back that afternoon with more papers and a serious expression. He said given my father's escalating harassment with the confrontation, and now the HR complaint, we needed to file for a no-contact order immediately. He'd already started the paperwork and showed me where to sign while explaining that the pattern of behavior would make judges take this seriously. I signed everywhere he pointed while Oliver played with Dave's pen cap, grateful someone with a clear head was thinking about protecting us when I could barely think straight at all. Constance came back while Dave was still sorting papers and saw me staring at the hospital billing statement that had already started arriving. The numbers made my stomach drop because even one day in the ICU cost more than I'd ever seen in my life. She sat down next to me and pulled out a different folder, explaining that the hospital had charity care programs for situations exactly like mine. We spent the next hour filling out forms while Oliver played with the buttons on the hospital bed, with Constance helping me list my tiny income from online tutoring and showing me where to write that I had 0 savings. She kept reassuring me that Miss Nyla's insurance would cover most of the medical costs, and the hospital wouldn't let me drown in debt over this. The relief made me cry again because I'd been imagining losing everything on top of losing her. That evening, my phone started blowing up with notifications from people I hadn't talked to since high school. Someone showed me my father's post on the town's Facebook community page, where he'd written this long thing calling Mizzy Nyla a predator who groomed vulnerable girls. He said she'd taken advantage of me when I was homeless and pregnant, twisting everything good she'd done into something sick. The comments were already piling up, with some people defending her as the best teacher they'd ever had, while others who didn't know her were buying his lies and calling for investigations. I wanted to type out the truth about how she saved us, but Dave grabbed my phone and said absolutely not. He explained that anything I posted could be used against us later, and we needed to stay quiet for legal reasons, even though it killed me to see her name dragged through mud while she lay dying. The next morning, we had the big care meeting that Constance had scheduled with the whole medical team. The conference room was full of doctors and nurses, and this woman who introduced herself as the hospital ethics consultant. She had this calm way of talking that made me feel less crazy as she explained quality of life and suffering, and what it meant to honor someone's wishes. She pulled out Missy Nyla's advance directive again and read the parts where Ms. Nyla specifically said she didn't want machines keeping her alive if there was no hope. The consultant helped me understand that keeping her on life support when she explicitly didn't want it Wasn't love, but actually disrespecting what she believed in. By the end of the meeting, I was sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe, but I finally understood what I had to do, even though every part of me wanted to keep her here forever. That night was the worst yet, because Oliver had nightmares and kept waking up screaming for Nana to check under the bed for monsters. He'd started sucking his thumb again, which he hadn't done since he was barely 1, and it broke my heart watching him go backward. I held him tight in the narrow hospital cot while he cried and kept asking why Nana wouldn't wake up to sing their special song that kept bad dreams away. All I could do was rock him and whisper that Nana loved him even when she was sleeping, which made him cry harder because he knew something was really wrong even if he couldn't understand what. The next day, Dave said we needed to go to Miss Nyla's house to look for important documents before anything happened. Driving there felt wrong without her in the passenger seat, telling Oliver to spot red cars like they always did. Walking through her front door with the key she'd given me made me feel like a thief, even though she'd said 1,000 times that her house was our house too. The smell hit me first. That mix of lavender lotion and old books that meant safety for 3 years. Her coffee cup still sat on the kitchen table next to the stack of essays she'd been grading with her reading glasses on top, like she'd just stepped out for a minute. Oliver ran straight to his toy box in the living room and started pulling out all the blocks Nana had bought him for his birthday, while I stood frozen, unable to move. Dave gently pushed me toward her home office, saying we needed to find insurance papers and bank statements and anything else important. In her office, I found this big binder on the desk labeled Important Documents, in her perfect teacher handwriting with tabs for everything. Insurance policies, bank accounts, the house deed, all organized with sticky notes explaining what each thing was like. She knew I'd need help understanding it all. At the very back was a sealed envelope with my name written on the front that made my hands shake, so bad I could barely open it. Inside was this long letter in her handwriting, talking about how Oliver and I had become the children she and Marina always dreamed of having. She wrote about how that morning she found me in the school bathroom was the day her life started making sense again after Marina died. She said watching me become a mother despite everything that happened had been the greatest privilege of her life. The letter ended with her saying she knew I was strong enough to take care of Oliver no matter what happened, and that she'd always be proud of her daughter, even if the law didn't recognize it that way. I sat on her office floor sobbing while Oliver played in the next room, clutching this letter that felt like goodbye. Dave sat down next to me and started going through the binder page by page, explaining what everything meant in simple terms I could understand. Miss Nyla had left everything to me and Oliver in her will, but there was still a mortgage on the house from when she refinanced to pay for Marina's cancer treatment. He showed me the statements with all these medical debts and credit cards I never knew about because she never wanted us to worry about money. The probate process would take months, he said, and we might have to sell the house to pay everything off. The thought of losing her house on top of losing her felt like too much, but Dave said we'd figure it out one step at a time. Back at the hospital, Dr. Wong was waiting with a new proposal that made my chest tight. He wanted to reduce Missy Nyla's sedation tomorrow morning to do one final test for any response to stimulation. He was careful to explain this was just to be absolutely thorough, and we shouldn't expect any improvement based on all the previous tests. But he understood I needed to know we'd tried everything possible before making the final decision. I agreed immediately because even though I knew what the outcome would be, I needed to see for myself that she really wasn't in there anymore. The test day came and they slowly reduced her medications while Dr. Wong and 2 other doctors watched the monitors. Oliver sat on my lap playing with his toy car, making vrooming sounds while we waited for any sign that Ms. Nyla could hear us. Dr. Wong called her name loudly and shined lights in her eyes and squeezed her nail beds to check for pain response. Her eyes stayed unfocused, staring at nothing even when he moved his hand in front of her face. He asked her to squeeze his hand, and her fingers stayed limp. Her pupils didn't react right to the light, and there was no response to any of the painful stimuli they tried. After 30 minutes of testing, Dr. Wong put his hand on my shoulder and said what I already knew but needed to hear. There was no meaningful brain function left, and Miss Nyla wasn't going to wake up. The machines were keeping her body alive, but she wasn't really there anymore. Oliver looked up from his car and asked if they fixed Nana yet, and I had to tell him no while trying not to completely fall apart. That afternoon, Constance brought in this woman who specialized in grief counseling for young caregivers. We sat right there next to Miss Nyla's bed while this counselor validated how impossible this whole situation was for someone my age. She said it was okay to feel angry and scared and overwhelmed all at the same time. She taught me this breathing technique where you count to 4 breathing in and hold it, and count to 4 breathing out, which actually helped when I felt like I was going to pass out from panic. The counselor said anticipatory grief was just as real as regular grief, and I wasn't weak for already mourning Ms. Nyla even though she was still technically alive. She gave me permission to feel everything I was feeling without judgment, and promised it was normal to wish someone else could make this decision for me. My phone rang while I was walking back to Ms. Nyla's room, and I almost didn't answer the unknown number. My mother's voice came through small and broken, asking if it was true about Miss Nyla being in the hospital. She said she heard from my cousin who saw the Facebook posts, and she wanted to see Oliver, and maybe we could work something out. Her words mixed apologies with conditions about coming home if I'd just say sorry to Dad for the trouble I caused. She asked if we could meet somewhere without him knowing because he'd be so angry if he found out she called. The conversation made me want to throw my phone at the wall because even now she couldn't just be my mother without strings attached. I told her she could only meet Oliver if my father had nothing to do with it, and we'd meet in a public place with other people around. She agreed, but her voice shook with fear about going behind his back, and I realized she was still as trapped as I used to be before Ms. Nyla saved me. We set up a meeting for next week at the park if she could get away without him noticing. The HR person from the school called right after and said their investigation found nothing wrong, and lots of teachers wrote statements about how professional Ms. Nyla always was. They were keeping the file open just for paperwork, but it was clear they saw through my father's lies completely. One tiny victory while everything else was falling apart around me. The next morning, a woman who worked with kids came to help Oliver understand what was happening to his Nana. She brought dolls and sat on the floor with him, showing how Nana's body was very sick, and the machines were helping her breathe. Oliver watched her move the dolls around, and seemed to get that Nana couldn't wake up, but he kept asking if she'd be better tomorrow. The woman was patient, and kept explaining in simple words that sometimes bodies get too sick to get better. Oliver nodded, but I could see he didn't really understand, because he kept looking at the door waiting for Nana to walk in. That afternoon, I took Oliver to the cemetery where Marina was buried because it felt like Missy Nyla would want her to know what was happening. Oliver ran around picking dandelions while I sat by the headstone and told Marina that Missy Nyla might be coming to be with her soon. I explained how Miss Nyla saved us and became our family, and how I didn't know how to let her go even though I knew what she wanted. Oliver brought his handful of dandelions and put them on the stone, asking if Nana would play with this lady in heaven. I said yes through my tears and held him tight while he waved bye-bye to Marina's grave. Back at the hospital, Dr. Wong was waiting with his final report, and I knew from his face what he was going to say. He explained that keeping Miss Nyla on life support wasn't helping her, and went against everything she wrote in her papers about not wanting machines. He was gentle but clear that it was time to let her go peacefully without more suffering. The weight of his words pressed down on me like something physical crushing my chest. That evening, I sat alone in Miss Nyla's room and opened her letter again while Oliver played with his cars on the floor. Her handwriting blurred through my tears as I read her words about not wanting to linger on machines and trusting me to make the right choice. She wrote about how proud she was of the mother I'd become and how lucky Oliver was to have me. She gave me permission to let her go and said she'd always be watching over us just like Marina watched over her. Every part of me wanted to keep her here even if it was just her body breathing with machines, but I knew that wasn't what she wanted. Dave came by the next morning with papers for the restraining order against my father and said the court date was set for next month. He explained that the Facebook posts and the HR complaint showed a pattern that judges took seriously. The legal protection felt like Miss Nyla was still fighting for us even from her hospital bed. That same afternoon, my father showed up at the hospital trying to get in, but security stopped him at the door thanks to Constance's earlier warning. He made a huge scene demanding to see his grandson and screaming about his rights while people stared. The guards walked him out and gave him an official paper saying he couldn't come back or he'd be arrested. I watched from a window upstairs feeling scared but also protected by all these people Ms. Nyla had put in place to help us. Betty took Oliver to the playroom while I went to one more counseling session to practice the breathing exercises for when I made the final decision. The counselor helped me understand that my grief about losing Miss Nyla was separate from my responsibility to honor what she wanted. She reminded me that loving someone meant respecting their wishes even when it hurt more than anything. I left that session knowing what I had to do, even though every cell in my body screamed against it. The next morning, I found Dr. Wong in the hallway reviewing charts, and my legs felt like jelly walking up to him. I told him we'd take Miss Nyla off the machines tomorrow after Oliver and I could say goodbye the right way. He nodded and put his hand on my shoulder for just a second, before explaining they'd make sure she was comfortable with medicine. The nurses would give us all the time we needed in the room and nobody would rush us. Oliver was playing with his toy cars on the waiting room floor when I picked him up and carried him to Ms. Nyla's room. We spent that whole day making the room special for our goodbye with her favorite poetry book that she used to read to us every Sunday morning. The nurses helped us tape Oliver's crayon drawings all around her bed, showing stick figures of our little family holding hands. One nurse brought paint so we could make handprints with Oliver's tiny hand pressed against Ms. Nyla's bigger one on paper. Oliver kissed each of Nana's fingers one by one, just like their morning game, while I played Marina's favorite song on my phone. He kept asking when Nana would wake up to see his pretty pictures, and I just held him tighter. That night, after Oliver fell asleep in the chair, I set up my phone to record a video for him to watch when he's older. I explained who Misty Nyla really was, and how she saved us when nobody else would help. My voice kept breaking while I told the camera about her choosing to be his Nana, and loving him from the first second she saw him. I talked about all the songs she taught him and the books she read and how brave she was standing up to my father. The video went on for 20 minutes of me crying and starting over, but I needed him to know everything. The withdrawal morning came too fast, and my whole body was shaking when the respiratory team arrived. They explained each step while I held Miss Nyla's hand so tight my knuckles went white. Oliver sat on my lap playing with her other hand and humming the song she always sang at bedtime. The ventilator made a weird sound when they disconnected it, and suddenly the room got quiet without all the machine noises. Missy Nyla's chest moved up and down on its own for the first time in days, but each breath was shallow and far apart. I whispered in her ear that we loved her, and it was okay to go be with Marina, who was waiting for her. Oliver waved bye-bye to Nana and blew her kisses like we taught him to do when leaving for daycare. Her breathing got slower and slower over 30 minutes while I told her every single thing I was grateful for. The last breath was so quiet I almost missed it, and then nothing for a whole minute before the nurse checked for a heartbeat. She shook her head gently and wrote down the time while I sat there holding Oliver, who kept trying to wake Nana up for their morning song. The doctor came in to confirm and sign papers while more nurses appeared to disconnect all the monitors and IVs. They let us stay with her body for an hour, and Oliver kept patting her face, asking her to open her eyes. Constance stood in the doorway the whole time, not saying anything, but being there in case we needed her. The organ donation lady came to explain that Missy Nyla couldn't donate because of her age and heart damage, which felt wrong. She should have been able to help people even after death the way she helped people her whole life. We arranged for the funeral home to pick her up, and I chose cremation because that's what she wanted according to her papers. The school principal called to say they'd hold a memorial service in 2 weeks at the gymnasium, where she taught for 20 years. Oliver didn't understand why we were leaving Nana alone at the hospital and screamed the whole way to the car. 2 weeks crawled by in a blur of paperwork and phone calls and trying to explain death to a 2-year-old who kept looking for Nana. The school HR department officially closed their investigation and sent a letter saying they found zero evidence of any inappropriate conduct. Missy Nyla's teacher friends organized the most beautiful memorial with photos from her whole career and students reading poems. So many kids stood up to share stories about how she changed their lives or helped them through hard times. A few mentioned knowing she helped a student in need without saying my name, which made me cry harder. Oliver played with his blocks in the corner and kept looking around for Nana every few minutes. My father showed up at the memorial even though Dave had filed the restraining order, and it was already approved by the judge. School security grabbed him before he could get close to us and walked him out while he yelled about his rights. My mother sat in the very back row with tears running down her face, but she didn't try to approach us. The whole room full of people who loved Miss Nyla made my father's poison seem small and stupid. After the service, Dave sat me down to explain the probate situation, and my stomach dropped when he showed me the numbers. Miss Nyla had taken out a second mortgage to pay for Marina's cancer treatment and barely had any equity left in the house. The monthly payments were more than I'd ever be able to afford, even with a full-time job, which I didn't have. He recommended selling the house fast before it went into foreclosure, and at least walking away with something. Packing up Miss Nyla's house felt like ripping my heart out piece by piece while Oliver kept asking when we were going home to Nana. I could only take what would fit in our new subsidized apartment that accepted my housing vouchers from the state. 2 bedrooms that smelled like old carpet and cigarettes, but it was better than a shelter and we could afford it. I packed every single one of Miss Nyla's favorite books, even though we didn't have shelves yet. The first night in the apartment, Oliver pulled down book after book asking me to read them in Nana's voice. I tried my best, but my voice sounded nothing like hers, and he knew it wasn't the same. We made a special shelf just for his books that Nana used to read, and he touched each one before bed like a ritual. The next morning, I opened my laptop while Oliver ate his cereal and started filling out the community college application online. The personal statement box stared back at me empty, and I typed about how Missy Nyla saved my life when my own family threw me away, and how she taught me I could write my way to something better. My fingers shook typing about being 16 and pregnant and homeless until a teacher saw me and decided I was worth saving. The admissions counselor called 2 days later and her voice cracked when she said she'd read my essay 3 times and was waiving my application fee. She gave me names of support services and said the school had resources for single parents, and I hung up crying because Miss Nyla always said education would be my way out. Oliver's first day at the subsidized daycare center was the worst morning since the hospital. He screamed and wrapped his arms around my neck so tight I couldn't breathe while the teacher tried to gently pry him off. He kept sobbing for Nana and reaching for me as I backed out of the room, and I threw up in the parking lot from guilt. The teacher called after lunch to say he'd finally stopped crying and was playing with blocks, and by day 3 he only cried for 10 minutes. By the second week, he ran to show me the picture he'd drawn and only whimpered a little when I left. My mother texted asking to meet at the park by the river, and I agreed but told her to come alone or I'd leave immediately. She showed up with a bag of toys for Oliver, and her face looked older and more tired than I remembered. She watched Oliver play on the swings and said she was sorry she didn't protect me, and sorry she let him throw me out, and sorry she was too weak to leave him. I told her sorry didn't give us those years back, but I'd take what she could offer as long as she understood our boundaries. She nodded and handed Oliver a stuffed elephant, and he hugged it tight while she cried. Dave called with the court date for the restraining order hearing and said the judge had reviewed all the evidence, including the Facebook posts and the false complaint to the school. The hearing lasted 20 minutes with my father's lawyer arguing about parental rights while Dave showed screenshot after screenshot of harassment and threats. The judge granted 3 years and told my father any violation would result in immediate arrest. Dave said the online attacks slowed down after that. Though my father still posted on pages I didn't follow about ungrateful daughters. The tutoring website approved my profile using the teaching methods Miss Nyla showed me when I helped her grade papers. My first student was a middle schooler struggling with essay structure, and I taught him the same outline format Miss Nyla taught me. 3 more students signed up the next week, and soon I was tutoring 15 hours a week on top of my own classes. The money barely covered groceries and gas, but each small payment felt like proof we could survive this. Oliver learned to play by himself while I worked, and I'd give him goldfish crackers to keep him quiet during video calls. 4 months after Ms. Denilah died, the school called about dedicating a memorial bench under her favorite reading tree where she used to eat lunch. The principal asked if I'd speak at the ceremony, and I stayed up all night writing about how teachers save lives just by seeing the kids everyone else ignores. That morning, Oliver picked dandelions from the apartment complex lawn to bring to Nana's tree. I stood at the microphone with Oliver on my hip and read about Ms. Nyla taking in a pregnant 16-year-old that nobody wanted and giving her a family. The whole English department was crying, and several students came up after to say she'd helped them too. Oliver put his flowers on the bench and patted it like he was petting it. Our bedtime routine became sacred, with Oliver pulling down one of Nana's books and climbing into my lap while I read in my voice that would never sound like hers. We'd look at her picture on his dresser and he'd tell it about his day at daycare and what he ate for lunch and which kid pushed him on the playground. Sometimes he'd ask when she was coming back, but mostly he'd wave and say, "Night, night, Nana." The grief sat heavy in my chest every single night, but so did the memory of her voice telling me I was stronger than I knew. That last night, I lay in our tiny apartment listening to Oliver's breathing, and the neighbors arguing through the thin walls and the sirens in the distance. My whole body ached from exhaustion, but we'd made it through another day, and tomorrow we'd make it through again. Oliver had started saying Mama more clearly that week, and each time I heard it, I remembered Mizzy Nyla's joy when he first said Nana. We were building something new from the pieces she left us and choosing each other every day just like she taught us to do. That's all for now. You clearly have free time if you made it to the end. Go on, subscribe, and make it official.